This is Stanford Engineering's Future of Everything, and I'm your host, Russ Altman. When we watch a video or read text or listen to someone speaking on the internet, we have an expectation that the media is trustworthy, that it represents the person or people that are communicating accurately, and that they really said what they said, that it captures images of the world that are real and in the correct context. We want to be able to know when we are watching or hearing data sources that are real, reliable, and truthful. And we also want to know when we're watching fiction, fake media that has been created perhaps or probably to mislead us. Unfortunately, AI systems for creating very realistic images of people speaking and moving, the so-called deep fakes, are getting very good at appearing real. We can't just trust our eyes and our ears like we used to be able to. The ability to generate false images and videos could be catastrophic. Imagine somebody making a video of the president saying inflammatory things that could lead us to war, or people trying to cover up war crimes by recreating truths. We need ways to authenticate what we are consuming and know that whether it's fact or fiction. Jonathan Dotan is a fellow at the Stanford Center for Blockchain Research and the Stanford Compression Forum. He's also the founding director of the Starling Lab for Data Integrity, which is devoted to creating technologies that will allow us to know the full custody chain of any kind of media from the time it's captured to when we're listening to or viewing it. So Jonathan, thanks so much for being with me. And you've worked on projects to ensure that online media, especially video, images, things like that, can be trusted and verified. What got you into this, and what is the nature and size of the problem that you're trying to address?
Thanks for having me, Russ. It's really great to be here and reaching out to the Stanford community. We're so proud to be a lab that's based at Stanford and at USC, so this is great to connect. I guess the easiest way to explain how I got into this is right before I took up my fellowship at Stanford, I was a writer and producer on the television show Silicon Valley. And if you've seen the show, we basically bet the whole show's plot on this idea that you might want to have a decentralized internet. And so as we were writing this and realizing that really the table stakes for this type of internet is perhaps our entire digital future, then I got deeper and deeper and started to understand that part of the chaos that we really have now with the internet has been caused by the fact that we don't really know what is a piece of authentic content. And that small insight ended up developing into now a 4-year program where we look at data of all kinds, whether it's images or video, Facebook pages, websites, etc. And we try to create a new root of trust using advanced cryptography to help establish for any form of reader an idea of what is an original piece of content. So I would say this began with really just a simple question. How do you know what's real online?
So, yeah, and that is a pretty basic question, and I actually don't even know how to get my head around it. So, so I know that in your framework that you describe, in a lot of your work, you kind of break it down into capturing, storing, and then verifying. I don't know if that's the order, but those are 3 fundamental tasks. Can you kind of go through those? Let's say I have an image. How close? So, for example, do you have to be? Does there need to be a piece of software in my camera at the very moment that the pixels are generated? Because I'm worried that if it's a little bit too far away, if it's any much farther away than that, already you have an opportunity for deceit, because I could mess with the pixels before I ever even admit that I've taken a picture. So, okay, so let me step back. Tell me about capture, storage, and verify.
So you're referring to what we've now called the Starling framework, and this was born not out of anything that's actually far-fetched. It was really listening closely to practitioners. We understood that actually this is what they do today, right? Any time that you're going to present some form of multimedia to viewers, you're going to go through this process, right, in which you're going to first capture the image or the video or the website or whatever it is that you want to go and show people as this documentation. You're then going to store it because you got to find a way to hold on to it and then show it to readers in a different format. And then finally, you'll have to go through an editorial process where the humans come in and they verify the veracity, essentially, of the content of the images or video. That's done already. What's new here is that we are using new cryptographic tools that in each of those steps, you can now use new forms of math, really, to help establish an attestation so that you know at the point of capture, can we lock down the information? At the point of storage, can we audit it to make sure that nothing has been changed as it's been stored? And then finally, when you're verifying it, can we ensure that, hey, Russ, if you are saying as a fact checker that this is something that's real, well, then is it possible for us to make it super clear that you said this at this exact time and for that to be an immutable record of that fact check, right? So
yes.
These are things that I think what's exciting about it is that now we have technology with cryptography that's available to any user. And so we'll get into the specifics as we talk about this, but the reality is that with your mobile phone alone, you have really advanced hardware, firmware, software that you can use, and now we're getting a chance to allow anyone to use this technology.
Yeah, so this is a super important problem. You're well aware, and it's come up in previous conversations about deep fakes and the great concern that they're having. And interestingly, when people think about cryptography these days, a lot of people are thinking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. But a lot of those same technologies, I think, are critical for this chain of veracity that you're creating in your projects. So tell me what is a typical project that you're working on that kind of takes advantage of this and avoids some of the pitfalls of not doing this kind of clear chain of custody, my phrase, for digital media?
Well, you touched on a lot there. Let me come back to something you said, because it's let's define our terms, right, in a very academic way here. When people think about crypto today, it's become this kind of shorthand for cryptocurrency. Yeah. Right? They say, oh, crypto this, crypto that. Well, what they're really referring to is things like Bitcoin, as an example, which is fashioned as a store of value, which has been put forward as a type of new currency, right? That is accepted by millions of people all over the world. Okay, but that's actually not what crypto is short for, right? The full and real, the original definition of crypto is cryptography.
Right.
And what you do with cryptography, if you want to boil it down, is you can do really two things. One is you can authenticate information. So you can come up with like a fingerprint to know exactly how to represent that information in such a way that if it's manipulated in any way, that you would be able to tell the difference between the original, the authenticated original, and the changed value. The second thing that cryptography can do is that it's able to provide encryption so that I can hide the information and make it selectively available as and how I choose. Mm-hmm. And in both of these cases, you can imagine, like, this is really powerful for anyone that wants to publish information online, because it essentially gives people choice. And there's a way for anyone who wants to try to control the flow of information and prove the veracity and the validity of information to say, hey, here's some really advanced math to help establish confidence in this data. So when we started to strategize, we realized, all right, well, who are the types of stakeholders that have the most at stake here with our digital future? And so we started with historians. And the project began by taking 55,000 records of video testimony of the survivors of genocide, from testimony ranging from the Holocaust all the way to contemporary examples in Myanmar. Mm-hmm. And the idea was, could we catalog all, that information's already been cataloged, but could we now use cryptographic tools to ensure that as the information is being stored, we will know in decades and centuries to come, as deep fakes and things get more and more complex and persuasive, we'll know what that original file is. That's the first thing.
Right.
And then the second thing is that as we use cryptography, we can now start to distribute the information so that it can be stored not just in one place or one Amazon instance, but potentially we could store it in thousands or maybe millions of different nodes. And that for us was a more resilient form of storage. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, surely with this type of vulnerable history, we would want it to be spread as far and wide as possible to minimize the potential of an attack, where if a node went down, you would lose that history.
Yes.
All right. So that's really where we got started. We then continued by moving into to speaking with journalists. And that really came out of some big questions that we had around the 2020 election. And our concern was that we knew that there was a lot of controversy already about fake news, alternative facts, as they were kind of circulated, which isn't a thing. And we worked with Reuters to help secure their photographs so that every photo that they took, we could use cryptography at each step as they capture, stored, and verified information. And that workflow was piloted during the March primary in California. And then from the 78 days between the election and the inauguration, we managed to actually seal into a cryptographic record every photograph that was taken of the US election by Reuters. And then finally, the last use case has been in the area of the law. And about 2 years ago, we got started on documenting war crimes in Syria using this technology. Obviously, accountability in Syria is still a long ways off. And so we need to not only have really robust records of what has happened over the last 10 years, but we also need to keep it around because it's going to take time.
Unfortunately, similar situations have arisen even since then.
That's right. Yeah. So in Ukraine, as that war started in February, I took our team and we basically, many of them have not slept for weeks now in working tirelessly to bring new technical and legal tools to the fore to really help prosecutors both at the international level and also domestic.
So this is really great, but it begs a question that's in my mind: is the people who don't believe in veracity and who believe in the ability to manipulate reality, they're unlikely to fully understand the technologies underlying your work, and so you have this challenge, I would guess, in how do you keep it simple enough so that the regular person who just wants to know what the truth is can understand all of this very complicated infrastructure with which you're trying to guarantee that these images, these sites are truthful. It just seems very difficult to me to, as things get more complicated in order to get security, you also have a problem of saying, well, trust us. This is a lot of math. It's very complicated, but you should really trust us. So how do you handle that conversation with people?
Well, I think some people are beyond reason at this point. I mean, that's no amount of math, no amount of technology is going to convince somebody if they really don't want to believe something. They've got a whole host of, I'd call it irrational beliefs that that's for a different department at Stanford, I think, to deal with.
Sure.
It's a matter of psychology and it's a much deeper rooted issue. I would say that our work is really looking at something I think we all take it for granted, which is that we believe that digital records are going to be around and that we can trust them, right? And I think that anyone who's experienced a hack or any form of internet outage or some deletion of files knows that actually things are pretty vulnerable with digital records. And so I'd say for the vast majority of people who don't believe in these crazy conspiracies, I think that there's an understanding that the internet is actually fragile and that we need to find new mechanisms to shore it up. So I say that's probably the very first thing we're doing. The other thing is that there's a growing recognition that with the arrival of deepfakes and other forms of really commonplace now tools for manipulation of images and video and audio, that we need this way of establishing provenance. Today, that might not necessarily be as big of a deal because deepfakes are somewhat easy to spot with just our own eyes. In the future, I don't think we can take that necessarily as an assumption. So I'd say we're trying to get ahead. And the idea is that we can use some of the most advanced tools. And yes, they are difficult to use today, no question about it. And if I was to go and try to explain to the average person what a blockchain is and how it works and how hashing works and how various encryption schemes work, I'd lose them pretty quickly, right? At the same time, though, I think in the future, as these tools become more commonplace and really recede into the backbone of how all communication works on the internet, people will use them every day without even knowing that they'll use them.
Yes.
And so that's really what we're trying to do is we're planning for that day.
So forgive me, I just need to probe a little bit more. we think a lot for all technologies about dual use. So technologies that are invented for good people figure out how to use them for less good or even nefarious. Is there ways in this vision of yours for a bad player to kind of hijack this and kind of ensconce in the blockchain falsehoods? And what can you do to try to prevent that from happening?
So not just one way, many ways.
Okay.
And part of the reason we created the lab was that we wanted to bring a sober and hype-less approach to all of this, because obviously there's billions of dollars pouring into the Web3 space, and everyone's talking about how blockchain is going to kind of save the world. And I think my biggest concern is really the naivete around all of that. Mm-hmm. Yes, like we are all really excited that there's some new tools, and I think we all have at this stage really good intentions, but let's go back to 2008. Another technology there, which was basically Web 2 technologies and social media, they were also presented as this thing that was going to save the world, right? Everyone was going to have friends all over the world with Facebook, and we were going to be friends, and dictators were going to fall, and that was it, end of history, right? And of course that didn't happen. And I think that the problem there is potentially the risk that we face now, which is that you have this exuberance and naivete and unrealistic set of expectations. And so part of the work that we do at the lab is that we're very even-handed in our approach. And we say, okay, here's what the technology can do technically. And then now let's think a little bit about what are the risks? Like, could this type of technology be flipped over, as you mentioned, in a dual use? And I can give you numerous examples, not only hypothetically how this could happen, but in places like North Korea, where they've had close to a decade of experience in using the very same tools that we used, let's say with Reuters. They've had their own version of them and used them for things like censorship or surveillance. So this is very much on our mind, that we want to create an ethical and technical framework at the same time, so people know what a best practice is for use.
This is The Future of Everything with Russ Altman. More with Jonathan Dotan next on Sirius XM Business Radio, channel 132. Welcome back to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman, and I'm speaking with Jonathan Dotan of Stanford University and the Starling Lab for Data Integrity. In the last segment, Jonathan told us the importance of establishing a chain of custody for media and what the challenges are in doing so, in addition to some examples of what they've already done. Now he will tell us how this relates to a new, more truthful version of the web, which some people are calling Web 3.0 or Web 3. He will also describe some of the software prototypes that his lab is creating to help make Web 3 a reality. So in our last part of our conversation, Jonathan, you made a quick reference to Web 3. And for those of us who haven't been keeping track, can you give me the vision of what Web 3 is and why somebody might be excited about it?
Well, I think the first question, if you're wondering what Web 3 is go over and ask your 14-year-old daughter. She'll probably have a better answer than I do, because I think this generation that's now coming online and starting to use these tools, they get this in a pretty big way. So if we think of Web 2 as all of the technologies that we use today with social media and the services we consume from the big internet players, Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc.
Okay.
The reason we think of them as Web 2 technologies is because they were platforms that had these centralized forms of services. And what Web 3 is it's a response to all of the problems that come with that form of centralization. It's basically, Web 3 is, think of it as a whole new generation of technologies that's working from the ground up to decentralize power back to the end users so that they can control their data, they can control the choices that they make online, and that they can use now a new set of tools that can create incentives so that as they work and create new forms of digital interactions, that there could be ways that, aside from just propping up, let's say, Amazon's stock price, that the value of all of this activity in these networks might be something that is more equitably distributed among all of the users. So that's really the opportunity here, is to really think about all the problems with Web 2 and now come up with engineering solutions from the ground up to create a better future.
One more question about Web3, which is it a done deal? So like when I talk to my 14-year-old, it'll actually probably be a grandchild, but that's a different issue. When I talk to this person, is it a done deal, or is there going to be a battle over the Web 2 view of the internet and the Web 3 view of the internet? I'm trying to understand how that, if that evolution will be somewhat tumultuous and disruptive, or if there's going to be a smooth experience for those of us who are just internet users.
I must say I don't really know. And the reason why is that there is, at the beginning of all of these innovation cycles, there's this just incredible amount of excitement. And the people that are the biggest proponents of the technology will tell you, that's it, we've solved it. And now once and for all, we're done. And obviously that just doesn't really happen. And what I'd say is this, that I think we are at the end of this era of Web 2, because people are realizing that there are huge political and economic costs in centralizing power into now these internet companies that are the most valuable companies in the world.
Yeah.
And when you centralize that power, even if those companies do their very best, there are still intractable issues with consolidating power in that way. And I think governments are realizing this, so they're regulating in different ways. And users are trying to figure out alternatives because they too are frustrated. And so, yeah, I think insofar as people recognize, every person on the internet recognizes that we might want an alternative, I think that's there. Now, the question is, what are the alternative technologies? And I think that's where the debate is. And so we're at the lab, we're trying to insert ourselves directly into that space so that we can have a point of view about how historians and journalists and lawyers can best use the technology and influence that roadmap.
Perfect segue, because the next thing I wanted to ask you is put some meat on the bones of the kinds of software prototypes that you're building at the lab to try to make this next phase of life successful and good.
All right, well, let's start with capture applications. So the very first thing we're doing is we are working with software vendors to create specialized apps that can sit on your mobile phone, and they can help you lock in photos so you can establish that these are the pixels that I took at this exact time.
Oh, that was my question right at the beginning. That's awesome.
Yep. Yeah, it's happening, right? And there are ways for that to not just be an app, but it can be something that's built into the operating system or even into the firmware of the device. Great opportunities, also crazy risks, right? Because if that type of technology was turned on without the user's permission, then suddenly every photo that you have is revealing information that you may not necessarily feel comfortable disclosing. So we're working in equal measure to figure out how we can make this possible and easy to use, but also making sure that we give the users choice so that they can be the ones to turn this on, right? The default setting is off, not on. All right, then we move into storage, and we're working with a variety of different partners to think about ways of doing distributed storage so that you're not just placing information on Amazon or Google or Microsoft cloud service providers, but you're doing distributed storage. And that's actually really exciting because it means that any device that can store information, such as a mobile phone, all the way up to an enterprise server, you could use those in a distributed fashion. And this is something that should feel actually pretty familiar. I mean, if you go back to the prior eras of like the early 2000s, remember things like
Napster the whole time.
Exactly. So peer-to-peer systems were using this type of technology, and they were global and they were hyper successful. And if you look at things like Netflix, like they really learned all the lessons from the illicit activity on the web with piracy, and then started to formalize that. So what we're doing is we're simply, we know that this is possible technically, and now we're trying to build infrastructure that can allow for things to work in a distributed fashion, but at the same time, for you to have a way of knowing what is an original file, even if it's chopped up into a million pieces and spread all over the world. So that's basically, think of it as enterprise software. And then finally, on the verification side, there are a lot of different applications that are being used by fact checkers and lawyers and historians to index and to put it's reporting their analysis. And so we're registering all of that information and putting that also in new forms of storage so that those databases can be protected. And where this all lives in each of these steps is that we're using cryptography that can leverage things like blockchain technology, which you may have heard about. And that allows us to have really a way of what they call a trustless system, so that you're not centralizing trust into one authority, but you're distributing it to many, many different users so that it's harder to hack.
So let me ask you about the trust, because it seemed to me, and you can correct me, I think there's an 80% chance that I got this wrong. It seems to me that the verify step is very human. In other words,
Yes.
This is where opinions, curation, experience, is that true? And then how do we make sure that the folks who are doing verification are verified?
Well, right. I mean, that is a really good question. And frankly, we do not directly answer that, because we think that there's a big enough problem already in just saying, hey, Russ, what do you think of this photo? And when you give that answer, we want to make sure that that answer is attributed to you and that it hasn't manipulated. And we want to start there, because before you get into all the questions about, Russ, do you have the expertise to make this assessment? And what are your political views? And all of the reputational questions that one might want to get into, rightfully, we're saying, hold on a second. There's actually some basic hygiene that we need to sort out so that Russ is Russ. What Russ is saying at this exact time and place is now attached to this image and video. And amazingly, one of the prototypes that we built was that we worked with Adobe and the Linux Foundation with a project they called the C2PA. And that initiative is really working on content protection and authenticity. And we inject all of the information about Russ, what you say with a fact check as an example, actually directly into the photo in the video. So that means that you actually have now within a file not only the image pixels and the metadata around the time and date and place, but you have this web of knowledge that is stored within the photograph and the video. And the hope is...
And it could be more than one voice, right? It could be hundreds of voices.
You bet. That's right. And
literally
the hope is
and
that...
figuratively.
That's right. And so the hope is that all of that information can now be... It's more portable. So it's carried with that file no matter where you read it. Twitter, Facebook, the web.
We have just less than a minute, and I want to ask, where is this all going? What are some of the new projects you're looking at that we should be expecting to see in the future?
Well, we have 8 fellows that have joined the Starling's journalism program, and so look out for articles that they are writing in the next year, and these are exceptional reporters working for major publications. We have critical work that's being done in Ukraine, and we're going to be announcing some things later this month that are really exciting and meaningful for the advancement of war crimes prosecution. And finally, on the history side, we've been doing critical work in documenting the BLM movement, and we've got some very exciting announcements this year in a new archive that we're creating to preserve that amazing moment in 2020 when people came together to think about how we can change our discussion on race. And preserving that information, I think with each passing day, becomes clearly a harder task, and we're up for it.
Fantastic. Thanks to Jonathan Dotan. That was the future of data integrity. You have been listening to The Future of Everything with Russ Altman on SiriusXM Business Radio, channel 132.